The road stretched out before Daniel like an endless black ribbon, vanishing into the thickening storm. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the first drops of rain splattered against the windshield, their rhythm increasing in tempo, matching the anxious beat of his heart. The air outside was heavy with the smell of wet earth, and the distant rumble of thunder seemed to echo from some far-off, forgotten place. He glanced at the dashboard clock, 11:38 p.m. The night was getting late, and he still had miles to go before reaching home. Daniel flipped through the radio stations absently, hoping to distract himself from the brooding skies overhead. A voice crackled through the static. Severe thunderstorm warning in effect for rural areas. Flash flooding is possible. Stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary. Perfect, he thought bitterly, as the rain began to come down harder. He had no choice but to keep driving. The last thing he needed was to be trapped on some deserted back road in the middle of nowhere. The storm was just one more problem on top of an already miserable year. His life had unraveled in ways he hadn't anticipated. The divorce was final, leaving him estranged from his ex-wife and kids. He hadn't spoken to his family in months, and the familiar sensation of guilt gnawed at him. But the worst part, the part that he couldn't shake, was Jake. Jake's death still haunted him. A car accident years ago had claimed his life, and Daniel couldn't help but feel responsible. The storm raged around him, but his mind was lost in the past, back to the days when they were inseparable friends. Before Daniel had turned his back on Jake, when his life started falling apart. The headlights sliced through the rain, but the visibility was getting worse. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches swaying violently in the rising wind. Daniel forced himself to focus on the present. He just needed to get home. He flipped on the high beams, though they barely penetrated the thick veil of rain ahead. The radio flickered back to life, but the song that played was distant and distorted, as though it was coming from another time. He turned the dial to find a clearer station, but the static only grew louder. With a frustrated sigh, he switched it off altogether, the silence in the car only amplifying the storm outside. Suddenly, the car jolted as the wind picked up with a violent gust, and the rain turned into a solid wall of water. Daniel cursed under his breath, leaning forward to peer through the foggy windshield. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now, and he could feel the vibrations through the car. He had the distinct feeling of being watched, though there was no one for miles. It was just him and the storm. The rain fell harder, beating against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. Daniel squinted through the torrent, gripping the wheel tighter as the road twisted ahead of him. The headlights barely cut through the curtain of water now, and the wipers were useless against the relentless downpour. The storm had swallowed the world around him. Suddenly, a flash of lightning split the sky, turning night into day for the briefest moment. In that instant, Daniel saw a figure on the roadside. A man, standing completely still, drenched in the storm. The image was gone as quickly as it appeared, but Daniel's pulse quickened. "What the hell?" he muttered, scanning the road ahead. Another flash of lightning illuminated the night, and there the figure was again. This time, Daniel got a better look. The man wasn't just standing idly by, he was staring directly at him. A wave of cold dread swept over Daniel as the man's features came into focus. The water streaming down his face, the clothes clinging to his drenched body. Daniel knew him. He couldn't mistake those eyes, hollow and accusatory. It was Jake. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. Impossible, he thought. Jake was dead. He'd been dead for years. Daniel's hands trembled on the wheel as he slammed his foot on the brake, but the car skidded slightly on the slick road, the tires struggling for traction. He whipped his head to the side, searching for Jake again, but he was gone. The roadside was empty. The only sound was the steady hammering of rain and the distant growl of thunder. "I'm just tired," Daniel whispered to himself, trying to steady his nerves. "It's the storm playing tricks on me." But the cold sensation in his chest lingered. The image of Jake's soaked figure, his eyes fixed on him, felt too real. He accelerated cautiously, his pulse still racing, trying to shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The storm around him continued to rage, as if it had a mind of its own. But with each rumble of thunder, a gnawing thought crept in. What if that hadn't been his imagination? He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Daniel forced himself to keep driving, but the sight of Jake lingered in his mind like a dark shadow. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and his chest felt like it was caving in under the weight of his growing anxiety. He tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to that impossible image. Jake, standing there, soaked to the bone, staring at him. Another flash of lightning split the sky, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw something else. Another figure on the roadside. His mother. She stood motionless, her eyes locked on his as the storm whipped around her frail form. His heart pounded against his ribcage. His mother had died years ago, after a long illness. He hadn't been there when she passed. He hadn't even visited during her final days, too consumed by his failing marriage and his own self-destructive spiral to care. And now, she was there, watching him through the storm. He blinked rapidly, and when the next flash of lightning came, she was gone. "No, no, this isn't happening," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. His breath came in shallow gasps as panic gripped him. The storm was warping his mind, dredging up ghosts from his past. He couldn't bear to see them. People he had failed, people who had slipped through his fingers. The rain was relentless, and so was the darkness. Another burst of lightning, and this time he saw her. His ex-wife's brother, Peter. He was standing by the road, his figure outlined in the white-hot flash, his face cold and expressionless. Peter had never forgiven Daniel for what happened, for the lies he told that ultimately drove a wedge between their family. His betrayal had cost him not only his marriage, but also Peter's respect. Now, Peter stood in the storm, silently accusing him of everything he had done. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, and he could feel the guilt rising like bile in his chest. With each flash of lightning, another ghost appeared. People he had wronged, people he had failed. Jake, his mother, Peter. Each one standing in silent judgment, their faces pale and expressionless. The car felt like a cage, the walls closing in as Daniel's mind spiraled. He could almost hear their voices in the rolling thunder, soft whispers that carried his name through the howling wind. "You left us." He pressed his foot harder on the gas, but the road was slick with rain, and the car slid dangerously as he sped forward. The trees on either side of the road blurred together, twisted shapes in the storm, and the shadows seemed to stretch out, trying to reach him. The storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside him, cracking open the parts of himself he had buried long ago. The weight of all those lost connections, all those mistakes, crushed him with each mile he drove. The ghosts weren't going to let him forget. The storm raged on, but the road ahead grew clearer, more defined, as if it were leading Daniel somewhere he was meant to be. His heartbeat pulsed in rhythm with the rain hammering against the windshield, the car's tires splashing through water-filled potholes. The flashes of lightning had slowed, but every time they illuminated the sky, Daniel braced himself for another ghostly figure. Up ahead, the road forked, splitting into two narrow paths. Before he could even decide which way to turn, the next flash of lightning revealed a familiar silhouette standing at the junction, directly in front of him. Jake. Daniel slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. The rain pounded harder, as if it were trying to force him out of the car, as if the storm itself demanded he face what was in front of him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the figure standing just feet away. Jake's ghost stood unmoving, his clothes soaked and clinging to his body, his eyes fixed on Daniel. In the flickering light of the storm, Jake's face appeared almost human. But there was something off, something wrong about the way he stared, unblinking, through the rain. "Jake," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. His hand hovered over the door handle. The rational part of him screamed to drive away, but he couldn't. He had to face this. He stepped out of the car, the wind and rain immediately battering him, soaking through his clothes in seconds. Lightning illuminated the scene again, and Jake was still there, waiting. There was no escape now. Daniel's heart raced, and his pulse throbbed in his ears, deafening him to everything but the howling wind and the soft whisper of his own name carried in the thunder. "Why are you here?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. His eyes were locked on Jake, the ghost of his once closest friend. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "You left me," Jake said, his voice low and cold. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even angry. It was a statement, a finality that left no room for argument. The words sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. I didn't know what else to do," Daniel stammered, taking a shaky step forward. "I was falling apart, my life. You abandoned me when I needed you most," Jake interrupted, his voice growing louder, more powerful. "You turned your back on me, and now you'll pay the price." Thunder cracked overhead, and with it, Daniel could feel the ground tremble beneath his feet. The wind screamed louder, and Jake took a step closer, his face distorted by the flashes of lightning. He didn't look human anymore. His features twisted, his eyes dark and hollow. Daniel backed away, but he was trapped between Jake and the car. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Jake. I didn't know." Daniel's words broke off as his voice cracked with emotion. The guilt he had buried for years was rising to the surface, suffocating him. Jake moved closer, his presence heavy and oppressive, like the weight of the storm pressing down on Daniel's chest. "You knew," Jake hissed. "You knew what I was going through, and you left me to die. You let me fall apart, just like you did." Daniel couldn't breathe. The storm was inside him now, tearing him apart, unraveling everything he had tried to suppress. Tears mixed with the rain as he fell to his knees, the wind whipping around him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, everything was silent. The rain slowed, the thunder softened, and the weight on Daniel's chest lifted just slightly. He looked up through blurred vision, and Jake's ghost stood still, watching him, as if waiting for something. "I should have been there for you," Daniel choked out. "I failed you. I failed everyone." Another flash of lightning, and Jake's face softened, the darkness in his eyes retreating. But he didn't disappear. He just stood there, silent, as if waiting for more. The rain eased, becoming a soft drizzle as Daniel knelt on the road, his body trembling from both the cold and the weight of his confession. The thunder, once deafening, now rumbled faintly in the distance, like the last murmurs of a dying beast. For the first time since the storm had started, the world seemed to exhale, releasing some of its tension. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps, his throat raw from shouting and sobbing. He wiped his face, unsure whether it was rain or tears he was brushing away, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth had finally come out, the words he had kept buried for years. Jake's figure still stood in the road, illuminated by the occasional flicker of lightning. But something had changed. The anger, the malice in Jake's presence had softened, as though his ghost had been waiting for Daniel to finally admit his guilt. Yet he didn't vanish. He remained there, a silent reminder of everything Daniel had lost. "I should have done more," Daniel whispered, almost to himself. "I should have been there for you, for everyone." Jake's face, though still hauntingly pale, no longer twisted with accusation. He was just watching, observing Daniel as if he were waiting for something more, something that couldn't be undone in a single moment of regret. Daniel forced himself to stand, his legs shaky beneath him. The rain fell gently now, a steady rhythm that felt more like a bomb than an assault. He took a step toward Jake, his voice steady this time. "I'm sorry for everything. I know I can't fix what happened, but I'm not running anymore." The wind shifted, almost as if acknowledging the change. Daniel took a deep breath, and though the air was still heavy with moisture, it didn't suffocate him like before. Jake's figure, ghostly and solid at the same time, slowly began to recede, his outline blurred with each passing second, dissolving into the mist that clung to the trees. The tension in Daniel's chest eased as Jake disappeared completely, leaving only the faint scent of rain in his wake. The storm had finally broken. Daniel turned back to his car, the headlights still cutting a narrow path through the gray. His hands were shaking as he reached for the door handle, his body exhausted but lighter than it had felt in years. He slid into the driver's seat, the familiar hum of the engine comforting him. For a long moment, He just sat there, staring at the rain-soaked road ahead, unsure of what to feel. He had faced the ghosts of his past, but the weight of his actions, of his mistakes, still lingered. The storm may have passed, but its scars remained. He knew that. He would carry them with him. The car started with a low rumble, and Daniel slowly pulled back onto the road. As the rain continued to fall, gentle and steady, he drove forward, toward home, toward whatever came next. The road was quiet now, the rain reduced to a soft patter against the car's windows. Daniel drove in silence, the hum of the engine steady beneath him. The storm that had once consumed everything in its path was fading, leaving behind an eerie calm. Yet, as the car moved through the misty night, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. He reached the outskirts of town, familiar landmarks sliding past the window as the rain fell in thin sheets. The lights from the houses were dim, flickering through the fog, and a thick tension hung in the air. Even though the storm had passed, it left a weight in its wake, one that Daniel couldn't ignore. As he pulled into his driveway, Daniel cut the engine and sat still for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of the rain. He wasn't sure if he was ready to go inside. Everything felt different now. He felt different. He had finally faced the ghosts of his past, but the confrontation had left scars, ones that wouldn't heal overnight. He opened the door and stepped into the cool, damp air. The rain kissed his skin, soft and cleansing, so different from the violent torrent of earlier. He walked slowly toward the front door, every step feeling heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was pulling him back. Daniel glanced at the trees bordering his yard, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. For a brief moment, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He stopped, turning toward the woods. In the faint glow of the distant streetlights, he saw it. Just a shadow, just a glimpse, but it was unmistakable. Jake. He stood there, his figure barely visible through the mist, his face hidden in the dark. Daniel froze, his heart thudding in his chest. His mind raced, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was still watching, still waiting. Another flash of lightning illuminated the sky for the briefest second, and in that light, Jake was gone. The woods stood silent and still once more, but the feeling of being watched remained. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. The thunder rolled softly in the distance, and in it, Daniel thought he heard his name whispered. Faint, just a breath, but it was there, carried on the wind like an echo of the storm that had passed. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. He knew that he couldn't escape his past, that the ghosts he'd faced tonight were always going to be a part of him. They were quiet now, but they would never be gone completely. With a final glance toward the trees, Daniel turned and walked into the house, shutting the door behind him. The rain outside continued to fall, steady and endless, as the thunder rumbled one last time in the distance.